Got an array of K-series rods out today, so we'll take a look at some of the differences between engine codes. I got both K20 and K24 rods out, got a forged one to look at, and I'll talk to kind of my assumed maximum RPM on each one of these rods, at least in my experience with them. I won't talk to power levels because I've never actually bent a rod, an OEM rod on a K-series. Some guys have taken the weakest rod, like the K24A1. They've done like 600-700 horsepower. I've never tried that. Usually you'll get a failure at the big end bearing or the rod bolt specifically on OEM type applications. Even the cheaper forge rods, the rod bolt is the weak point. So let's get into it. First, we'll take a look at each rod, identify the block casting number and the actual code cast into each rod. Kind of go through each one, take some measurements, then talk about similarities and differences. I've got some speculations on what you could do to increase the kind of duty capability of some of the rods. We'll look at that a little bit. And then I'll talk about balancing toward the end. Take a look at the kind of the difference between what you get in an aftermarket rod versus OEM rods when it comes to, you know, those things. If you're pushing your engine as far as RPM, those things can come into play. It's also an easy way to just add a little bit more natural balance to your rotating assembly on an OEM build. You know, you could take some of these rods to like 8,000 RPMs, the OEM ones, 8,500 RPMs with the correct oil pump. You know, it'd probably be worth it to spend the time to balance, and I'll make a separate video on how to balance the rods. First up, the kind of two-lobe economy block. So this would be like a CRV or early element K24A1, also like an Accord K24A3, or like a base RSX K20A3 type architecture. One thing to note, the K20s do have a shorter rod. So this one here is PRB from like a RSX Type S, notably shorter by like a centimeter or so, to account for the shorter block, smaller displacement. But all those economy blocks are going to have a very similar overall cast. Code cast in this one for the K24 is PPA, and it looks like it's got about 17.6 millimeter thickness at the neck. Looking at the other side, 12.1 millimeters. Now, I kind of mentioned it. I mean, there's guys that are boosting completely stock K24A1s and doing like 600 horsepower. Again, I've never seen an OEM rod bend in a K series, but it's relatively cheap insurance to go with a forged rod in that kind of application. I always do it. I've got a number of boxes of them on hand. You know, it's like $600 USD for something that's going to guarantee that the internal isn't going to snap on you before something else. So, you know, a relatively cheap way to move that weak link in your system elsewhere. So the stock RPM on this thing is like 6,800 RPM, I think. You could easily safely run it to 7. The real issue with these things, the cheap rods, is the rod bolt. So if I pull one of these rod bolts out, and let's do a little comparison to the rod bolt on the next strongest rod, the K24A2 RBB. So, you know, there's a noticeable increase in thickness in the next better OEM rod. So 2-lobe rod bolts about 8 millimeters thick, 8.5 millimeters on the next better rod. So it's really these rod bolts that will fail or allow shift in the big end, leading to bearing failure or twist at the bearing cap. Also, I think this is the reason why you'll see two different torque specs when you look up, like if you just Google K24 rod bolt torque spec, you're going to see like a 16 foot-pound plus 90 value, and then a 22 foot-pound plus 90 degree value for the same bolt. And it's, you know, in my estimation, definitely the smaller bolt getting the lower torque spec. I don't really use these PPA rods. I got a whole stack of them. They're decent rods. I mean, I've seen worse equipment in, you know, like D series, Mazda Miata engines, stuff like that, that take an amount of abuse with like an eBay turbo setup. It's not the power that's going to cause you to change your rod. It's really your RPM goal, and you know how you want to make that power over RPM with selection of your turbo and all those things. But this is the weakest rod of the group. They can be had really cheap, like, you know, 70-80 bucks a set on eBay shipped kind of deal. It would get you into a K-Series build, cheap and easy, readily available, commonly found in a junkyard. It's going to be probably the rod that comes in any donor block that you have. Next rod here is K24A2 RBB casting. This is going to be out of like your Acura RSX. They were a favorite for a long time. They've been kind of displaced by the R40. Guys are having a lot of success running those R40 rods pretty hard. More than anything, the R40 is very common, and we'll kind of talk about that when we take a look at it. But first thing I wanted to point out, so, you know, the architecture of the RBB rod is very similar to the PRB RSX Type S rod. All these K24s and the, you know, better K20s run the same rod bearing. The base RSX K20A3 runs a smaller bearing. So for that reason, you're not going to want to use a K20A3 crank primarily, because it limits your rod selection. Obviously, there's aftermarket makers of that. I've never really done a lot of building with those cranks. The blocks themselves are fine. I mean, it's a 2-liter block with no oil jets. And that's totally fine for pretty high RPM and pretty high power. But overall, very similar construction. Let's take a look at the thickness of the TSX rod. So we're now up to 19.8 millimeters, comparing that to the Type S, 18.4. Take a look at it on this dimension, 13.2. Type S, 12. So you got a lot more meat on this TSX rod compared to that PPA rod. It's obviously going to weigh a little bit more, but well worth it for the extra power handling capabilities. Next thing I wanted to compare, so rod bolt out of the RSX Type S motor, rod bolt out of a TSX K24A2. So they're the same overall dimensions, same thread, and it looks like the RSX Type S bolt is just ever so longer than the TSX bolt. So, you know, this RSX bolt will thread right in and have no problem clamping this rod together. And the reason I bring this up is if you look for ARP rod bolts for an OEM K-Series, the only set available is going to be for your K20A2, the Type S engine. So you can see the issue is that it stands a bit proud. However, I'm willing to bet, you know, you got about, call it 21 mils of meat right there. So as this thing is rotating, you know, I'm willing to bet that if you ran an ARP K20A2 bolt in either your K24A2 or the K24Z the R40 rod, I'm willing to bet that you could clear that bolt to the bottom of the sleeve and everything else in that block. I haven't tried it, because generally speaking, those ARP bolts are going to be like a third or a half the cost just getting an aftermarket forge set. So, usually I just go for the full set. But I don't know, I'm tempted to take a look at that, maybe give it a shot. These rods, I got it kind of conservatively graded at about 8,000 RPM. I know lots of people that are daily driving TSXs and K24A2 swaps at that kind of RPM level. Others are going up 8,300, 8,500. You're definitely risking it at that point. And again, it's just the rod bolt. So if those ARPs fit, that could be the solution with your appropriate oil pump. And then I kind of mentioned it, but this rod bolt, it's an RBB part number rod bolt. It's the same for our 40. And so those ARP RSX Type S's are going to fit in this guy too. So we'll swap it over there, take a look. All right, looking at the R40. Very common rod. It's in tons of K24Z type engines. Again, it runs like an RBB rod bolt, slightly shorter than the RSX Type S rod bolt. But for fun, let's throw in that RSX rod bolt and take a measurement for clearance. But one major difference on this is they went to like a fracture split style rod. So this thing, even with no rod bolt in it, has, significant side load handling capability. Comparing that to the earlier rods, they all have a machined and then doweled surface. So there's more kind of play here laterally. It's something you can kind of feel, not necessarily see when you get the bolts tightened up a bit. But they definitely have, better engineering in rigidity on the big end. So that's definitely helpful. Guys are taking this like 8,000, 8,500 RPM with good success. I don't know if I'd recommend going over 8,500. Haven't done it personally. You're going to run out of breath on the engine without appropriately large turbo as well. So at that kind of RPM limit, you're really probably going to a forged type rod to support the type of power and RPM you're making. So let's throw the RSX bolt in. Check that clearance situation. I'd probably risk it even if it protrudes slightly beyond the base geometry of this thing. Reason for that being that I know the K24A2 rods fit, so okay, interesting. It's kind of hanging up here. To be successful in putting those ARP bolts in, you might have to kind of chase that thread. I think that's just a manufacturing error, so let's check it on the other side. If you're running a tap or a chase or something down these threads, you're also going to potentially change the torque value, so I don't know if I would risk that necessarily. Yeah, it's got a similar, well, it's a little better on this side, but yeah, similar issue. It won't hand thread in cleanly. All the TSX rods I've messed with haven't had that problem. So I'm sure you could do it. I'm sure a machine shop could like precisely cut out the burrs on the top of this to make that happen. But again, if you're spending that kind of money between the ARP bolts and the machine time, you might as well just buy the forged rod package. Let's take some measurements on the neck of this guy. It's about 18.5. It's actually somewhat thinner than the TSX rod in that dimension. It's got these kind of buttresses though, so there's probably a little bit more rigidity from that. .13 mil thickness. same thickness. Either of these rods are a great choice. I've generally preferred the R40. You know, with those fracture split rods, though, you definitely don't want to be dropping it and damaging that surface. So that's one thing to be aware of. They're also going to be much harder to remachine the big end if you do have a problem. So I guess be aware of that. Lastly here, a Eagle forge rod. This one's for a K20, so it's a little bit shorter than the rest of the rods we're looking at. Same bearing. It's going to run an ARP. Oh yeah, these are torqued in, so unfortunately I can't get those out, but they're running an ARP bolt, far higher torque spec. This thing's going to be machined for that higher torque spec. Something worth mentioning, if I was to try and put an ARP bolt in an OEM rod, I would definitely throw that rod in a vise, torque those bolts to their final torque spec, and then measure and see if it's distorted the outer round on this thing. I've seen that happen. These are reasonably beefy. They might be okay, but it's definitely something I'm going to check. Getting the big end machined isn't super expensive, but that's another reason I probably wouldn't try the ARP bolts in an R40 rod, just because of that fracture split. It's not going to be easy to then, you know, re-level out that machine surface with the dowels and create a smaller circle to machine. So if I do try that ARP bolt swap, I'm going to do it on an RBB rod. I mean, yeah, differences are obvious. It's like an H-beam, I guess. Yeah, H-beam type construction. Far beefier. Take a measurement here. So it's like 4.25 millimeters thicker than the thickest OEM rod we looked at. Similarly, 2.5 millimeters more thickness in this direction. Yeah, far beefier rod, easily good for like 600 plus horsepower, maybe 800. I've spun these to 9,500 on a K24. It'd probably do 10,000 on a K20. If you want to go over 10,000 on a K24, the supplied rod bolt becomes a problem. You got to get the ARP, is it 625? Again, if you do that, you're going to want to check your inside diameters and make sure that nothing's been pulled out of shape by that increased clamping force. But yeah, these bolts are, you know, real good for any typically streetable type K build. I mean, my God, if you're doing like over 600 horsepower, it becomes a little squirrely. If you're doing drag racing, you're probably not here looking for this information. So I don't know. I really recommend these rods. I guess like shout out to Eagle. I've used them a number of times, and it's really just because of the price point. Honestly, after looking at the Eagles hand in hand with like your typical eBay or like Max Peating rod or whatever type rod, they look extremely similar. Quality on those kind of Chinese made rods is shockingly good. I've never really seen one that measured out around on the bearing surface or had a problem. The only thing that I've had a problem with is they've overbored the bushing on the top end and left a little bit too much clearance in the pin. I think I have another video on my channel showing that. But in that case, I just returned the thing. I guess I lost the cost of shipping, but better that than assembling an engine that clatters on first start. Just out of interest, let's weigh each one of these rods, and I'll write down the number here. And then I'll talk about balance a little bit. To truly balance, you need this type of apparatus. I'll make an entire separate video on how to use that. First off, the PPA, the K24A1 rod. And we're just looking at a total weight, 496.35. $615.6. Call it 6.5. That's the RBB rod, K24A2. Next up, K24Z R40. 594.2. And to make a accurate comparison, let's weigh one of these OEM RSX Type S K20 rods, 559. And compare that guy to the forged option for K20. $445.65. All right, let me show you the breakdown of this. So you can see significant weight savings on the forge rod in addition to being stronger. Just another reason to get a forge rod set up. Not surprising, the R40 is slightly lighter than the RBB, just given that it's a little bit smaller dimensions in the neck. That's pretty much how they all break down. So lastly, we'll take a look at the weight of just some comparative OEM rods. So I got two of those Type S PRB rods here. And we're just looking at total weight. To actually balance them, you have to remove material from either end separately, which I'll save for a later video, but just as an example, so this first PRB OEM, 586.9. Checking out another OEM PRB, it's what is that, like 3 grams heavier? So it's not a ton of weight, but it's really the kind of where that weight is on the rod that'll make a difference. And if it's just a matter of putting, you know, this guy right here on the belt sander for a little bit, or taking a little trim off the very top of the rod, it's a worthwhile process to get some finer balance in your overall assembly. It doesn't take a ton of time. I think it's worth it. And then another nod to getting aftermarket rods. Let's take a look at a couple comparative forge. 497.05. So yeah, your forge rods are like less than 1/10 of a gram weight difference right out of the box. Like arguably not worth even touching these things. Although again, it's worth it to measure them end for end and make sure there's no big discrepancies there. But yeah, another kind of nod to getting the aftermarket rods. I really enjoy them. Cheap insurance, highly recommended. So let me know if you enjoyed this video on K-Series rods. I'll keep making this kind of stuff you know, as I disassemble K-Series and clean up parts, get them all socked away and organized. Maybe I'll give you a little basement tour at some point. But people seem to like them. I did one on the springs and valves last and had a couple interesting questions and stuff. So if you enjoy the content, like and subscribe.